Members. Questions without notice. The member for Blair.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. I refer to an email from the Duty Inspector Command Centre in Strategic Border Command in relation to the French au pair, stating in relation to the ministerial intervention submission, and I quote, "The ABF does not agree with the content or think it appropriate that the minister intervene." Why is this the sort of instance where the minister rushes to intervene?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, and I'll come to it in a minute. But if I may, I want to acknowledge—
No, members
Stephanie,
on both sides will cease interjecting. The Minister has the call.
I met Stephanie last night and I presented her with her award, and met Scott, and it was an incredible moment. You moved many people at the event last night, and it really is unimaginable, as both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have pointed out. But your true inner strength and the way in which you responded is a great credit to you, and the recall of the story and your contribution to those gathered last night, I think it's true to say you left a very lasting impression on everybody in that audience. So I too join in congratulating you. Thank you. Mr Speaker, in relation to the honourable member's question, I have said to this House and outside of this House before that I look at each case on its merit. Now, the honourable member made his own judgment in relation to a case that he presented to me, asking me to consider the matter. He was rallying for a convicted murderer, for somebody who had a very long criminal history. He was saying to me that he would like to see a better outcome for that individual. We can go to the member for Watson, who was advocating for a hate preacher. I can point out, Mr Speaker, different members opposite who have come to me over a long period of time asking for me to act. I'll tell you what I've done, Mr Speaker. I've cancelled 3,700 visas of criminals in this country, people that would have gone on to commit offences against Australians. I have cancelled the visas of 194 outlaw motorcycle gang members, people who are involved in the distribution of drugs to young people.
The Minister for Health will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Asking him to be directly relevant.
Just before I call the Minister, the member for Wright is warned. Just before I call the Minister back to the dispatch box, the Minister is obviously speaking on the policy topic. He's entitled to some context, but his entire answer can't be context. He will need to bring himself to the specifics of the question.
Mr Speaker, I was asked about a particular case. I said I dealt with the case on its merit. That's it. I deal with many cases. Now, something's been made of the fact that I dealt with this case within a matter of hours. I've dealt with many cases in a matter of hours. Kids who are sick, where the department's advised me that somebody should be deported because their tourist visa had come to an end or their visa had come to an end, a grandparent that's been ripped off, a person that wanted to go overseas for a funeral. I have looked at each of those cases on their merit, Mr Speaker, and I've made decisions based on the merit of each case. I am very happy to have my record compared to some of these opposite who were involved in the immigration portfolio in the great years of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd period of government in this country, Mr Speaker. I will have my record compared to any of them any day of the week.
I call the member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister advise the House on how our government is standing with Australian families to keep our economy strong, guarantee essential services and keep Australians safe?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the member for Latrobe for his question, Mr Speaker. And it is true, our government is standing with Australian families. We are standing with Australian families to keep our economy strong, because that's how you guarantee the essential services that Australians rely on, whether it's hospitals, whether it's Medicare, whether it's aged care, any of the services that Australians rely on. They rely on a strong economy, and a government that knows how to manage a budget, which this government has demonstrated over 5 years, Mr Speaker. And on top of that, we are keeping Australians safe, and we're bringing and keeping Australians together to focus on the challenges and the opportunities that are ahead. So Australian families that are having a go will get a go. That's what fairness means in this country under our government, Mr Speaker, and that's what we will continue to strive for the Australian people and Australian families in particular. We are guaranteeing, as a government, our government choice in education. Affordable education, Mr Speaker, for all Australians, whether it is in the state sector of state education, Mr Speaker, or it's affordable education in the non-state sector. We believe passionately, as Liberal and National parties, in the choice of parents to educate their children in the sector that they believe is best for their children, and that be an affordable choice for all Australian parents, Mr Speaker, and in the measures that have been announced by the Minister for Education in particular today. Funding for the non-state sector takes into account the actual parent income that is relevant to those schools to ensure the funding is directed in the most equitable way, and we welcome the support from both the Catholic Education Commission and the Independent Schools of Australia, who understand and have been delivering choice for parents for generations and generations. And those sectors have always understood that they have an ally and a partner in the Liberal and National parties, not just because we fund it, but because we believe it, Mr Speaker. That's why they can trust us when it comes to affordable education. But Australian families know we're protecting them when it comes to food contamination in the swift action we've taken in relation to the strawberries crisis that we've seen in recent days, and I thank the House for the support of that legislation. Australian families affected by drought know we're taking every step, whether it's making sure the feed, the hay can get from where it's grown to where it's needed, by simple changes and getting rid of non-common sense regulations that means the truck can keep going across state borders and they can keep on trucking to get that hay to where it's needed, because that's where the families need it. They know that we're acting, Mr Speaker, on family budgets to get electricity prices down and to deliver real tax relief to Australian families, more than $1,000 in that relief. We're standing up for Australian families, whether it's in aged care, whether it's in life-saving drugs, Spinraza, Mr Speaker, or for cystic fibrosis or Candy. That's what we're doing.
Concluded. The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that in the last month it's been revealed that the Minister for Home Affairs intervened in a matter of hours for 2 au pairs on tourist visas, misled the parliament over whether he knew one of the intended employers of the au pairs, participated in government discussions about childcare when he had an interest in childcare centres, and has doubts about whether he's even qualified to be a member of parliament and a minister in this government? Why is the Prime Minister continuing to support the Minister for Home Affairs?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I'm asked why I continue to support the Minister for Home Affairs, Mr Speaker. That was the question. Because he's doing a fantastic job, Mr Speaker. That's why I'm asked about interventions that have been made by our government, and in particular the Minister for Home Affairs. It may interest to the House that during his time as Minister, the Minister, when he had responsibility for these matters, exercised a ministerial intervention power to grant 4,816 visas. Now, Mr Speaker, in just 2 financial years between July 2011 and June 2013, the member for McMahon, when he was the Minister, and the member for Gorton intervened over 23,000 times, Mr Speaker.
Members on my
23,000 times.
The member for Corangamite.
23,000 times.
The member for Corangamite.
Gee. You made a pretty thick paper to go through all those 23,000 occasions, Mr Speaker, but there is a number that's bigger than 23,000 that relates to the member for McMahon, and that's the 25,000 people who turned up on illegal boats on his watch, Mr Speaker. That is his fault. That is their fault, Mr Speaker. But I'll tell you why. The other reason I support the Minister for Home Affairs, because together he and I, in the decisions we took as Minister for Immigration, and he as Minister for Immigration and Border Protection and Minister for Home Affairs, We cancelled 3,763 visas of non-citizens who committed crimes, 694 convicted for assault, 270 child sex offenders, 69 murderers, 193 for violent offenders, 194 outlaw motorcycle gang members, Mr Speaker. Now, we cancelled the visas of people like Alex Vella, who was the head of the Rebels motorcycle gang. Now, when I became the Minister for Immigration, they were very quick to tell me and the New South Wales Police Force that this was a person that should not be in Australia, and I was happy to act on that, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party sat and did nothing as the visa was renewed. They sat on their hands because when it comes to border protection, the Labor Party are more interested in protecting Australia from au pairs than they are, Mr Speaker, from protecting Australians from violent criminals.
The member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney-General update the House on the legislation our government has introduced into Parliament to deal appropriately with those who seek to sabotage our food supply, guaranteeing Australians food safety and standing by Australian families?
The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fairfax for his question, and it brings me great pleasure to tell the Parliament that just before question time the Senate did in fact pass the Criminal Code Amendment Food Contamination Bill, and that is a practical act of solidarity with our great farming families. And given the very important deterrence effect that should accompany these new offences, an answer here to the member for Fairfax question is an excellent opportunity to explain how and why the behaviour that we have witnessed in recent days is so terribly damaging to hard-working Australian farmers and families. That's why the behaviour is now going to be the subject of serious new offences, and particularly what our government wants anyone out there stupid enough or callous enough to be contemplating this sort of behaviour. What we want them to know is that there is now no longer any excuse of not meaning to cause loss or damage or alarm. That will no longer be an excuse for this type of behaviour. The new offences passed today of recklessly making false statements about the contamination of goods means that if someone makes a false statement which induces someone else to believe that it's true, and that person was simply reckless as to the fact that it would cause alarm or economic loss or a risk of harm, that person will now face a potential 10-year penalty of imprisonment. These laws now mean that there is no such thing as a harmless hoax when it comes to Australians' food. It's too early, unfortunately, to quantify the harm that has been done to hard-working farmers and families, but for anyone out there with any doubts as to how harmful this type of behaviour can be, I just note that in 1997 Arnott's Biscuits was the subject of a contamination incident where their biscuits were removed from shelves and for a period of 11 days, Arnott's lost $10 million over 11 days. And who is the victim of the sort of behaviour here that we've seen in recent days? It's not a large company or a conglomerate or a corporation. It is hard-working farming families. It's mums and dads, market gardeners, fruit growers, orchardists. These people work in back-breaking way, day in, day out, to make a living for themselves and their families. So I just finally note, Mr Speaker, that under Australian law, it has long been the case that you can go to jail for making a hoax threat, you can go to jail for pretending that something in the post contains a dangerous substance, you can go to jail for making a false call into 000. And the reason that that has long been the case is that these are not harmless acts. For anyone stupid enough to be contemplating anything that resembles a hoax or a false statement, you need to know first that that damages hard-working Australian families, and secondly, you can and likely will go to jail.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My questions to the Prime Minister. Today I met with Captain Jason Skanes and Lieutenant Colonel Damien Hick, decorated Afghanistan veterans. They're sitting in the third row of the gallery. For 5 years, Captain Skanes has tried to secure a visa for his Afghan interpreter who served with the Australian Army. These interpreters wore Australian uniforms, helped keep our diggers safe at great risk to themselves. Some have been murdered since. When au pairs can get visas in a matter of hours, why can't Captain Skanes even get a meeting with the Minister for Home Affairs?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable Leader of the Opposition for his question. The reality, Mr Speaker, is that this government has granted many hundreds of visas to people who have helped out, almost 1,000 in fact, Mr Speaker, to people that have helped out the Allied forces in the Middle East in theatres such as Afghanistan or Iraq. There are many interpreters and others whom we have been able to help, and we have been able to settle those people here. Mr Speaker, I have not intervened in cases where there is advice to me, not advice that I can go into publicly, but advice that is received to me from the intelligence agencies in relation to particular cases or individuals. I will not act against the national interests or against the national security interests of this country. My office has met with Mr Scaines. I'm happy to meet with him, but we've made it very clear in relation to this particular case, and I don't know whether the Leader of the Opposition has sought any sort of briefing on this matter. I don't know whether the opposition leader's received a briefing on this important national security matter before he's raised it in this place. But there are always significant equities. Leader of the Opposition. There are threats to our country. The Minister
will just pause for a second. I'm trying to listen to the Minister's answer. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition, the member for McEwen, the member for Barker and others are making that impossible. I'm going to assure members I'm going to hear the Minister's answer, and if that requires me ejecting them, I will. The member for Sydney and the member for McEwen are warned. You were interjecting earlier. We can get a video replay if you really need it. The Minister has the call.
So, Mr Speaker, I assume that the Leader of the Opposition has not had such a briefing. I'm happy to arrange such a briefing and for him to be provided with as much information as is possible. But I can tell you, Mr Speaker, the government is proud, particularly through the advice of the ADF and some of our international partners, to help settle people who are worthy of support in our country. But to finish on this note, there are some cases where I receive advice from the intelligence agencies. In those cases, acting in the national interest of our country, I will not issue that visa.
Now the Minister's concluded. The member for Barker interjected again. He's now warned as well. The member for Kennedy.
The Environment Minister. Documents sent on the 5th of March to the Government Compliance Unit and Federal Police raised questions of most serious irregularities in the use of $20 million for Crown of Thorns starfish eradication. Some 3 weeks later, April 9th, it was decided that all reef action funding to the bodies in question, Groompa, the RRF Research Centre and AMPTO, was terminated. Is the Minister aware that one of these paid for a parliamentarian's political advertisement, and further aware that since starfish are removed for free and for fun, will we be assured of a serious public investigation will be undertaken? And I emphasise public.
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank the member for Kennedy for his question. And it's a good opportunity for us to talk about how this side of the House is dedicated to the health of the reef. So I thank the member for his question.
Member for Greenway.
The member knows only too well.
Members on both sides. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The member for Kennedy knows that there are a number of threats to the reef. The crown of starfish is just one of those. Issues relating to water, issues relating to farm runoff. And what we are doing on this side of the House is we are dedicated to the health of the reef. Australians know that we are dedicated to the health of the reef, but in particular those 64,000 people, regional Queenslanders, they know only too well that we are dedicated to the health of the reef because they rely upon the reef for their jobs. Also, the reef contributes some $6.4 billion to the bottom line for the Australian economy. So we take it seriously. And there are a number of threats, and the crown of starfish is just one of those threats. But I can assure the member for Kennedy that I'm very, very happy to work with him, and perhaps you and I can have a conversation this afternoon. Thank you.
The Minister will resume her seat. Has the Minister concluded her answer? Has the Minister concluded her answer? The member for Kennedy. Now, the member for Kennedy can move a point of order if he knows, but if the Minister's concluded the answer, we're moving on. The member for Robertson has the call. We might just pause for a second. I think it's, if the member for Robertson could just bear with me for a second. Before we get too further into question time, I'd also like to inform the House that we have joining us in the gallery this afternoon the former member for Kingston, Susan Jeans. On behalf of the House, a very warm welcome to you. And we also have the former Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, Mr Paul Henderson. A welcome to you as well. The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Education. Will the minister update the House on how our government is standing by Australian families by giving parents greater choice in education?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Robertson for her question, because she knows affordable choice is incredibly important when it comes to education. We all want the best for our children. The Liberal and National parties have always believed that the best way to achieve quality in education is by providing choice in education. As John Howard said, and I quote, "We have always believed in the unconditional right of Australian parents to choose the nature and the quality of their education they want for their children. We are unashamedly the parties of parental school choice."
Member for McMahon.
Today we announced a package that will continue affordable choice for parents. It includes $3.2 billion to rebalance the schools funding model for non-government schools, as recommended by the National Schools Resourcing Board. And I'd like to thank Michael Chaney for the outstanding work he did with regards to that review. A new $1.2 billion choice and affordability fund for schools that are low-fee or disadvantaged, such as those in drought-affected areas. And I know the Prime Minister is very, very concerned to ensure for those drought-affected families that they can get assistance when they need it when it comes to choice for their children in the schools that they're going to. The $170.8 million to Catholic and independent schools for interim arrangements to allow schools to plan with confidence for the 2019 school year. Our schools package provides record funding to government schools, record funding to Catholic schools and record funding to independent schools. Over the course of our funding arrangements, funding will increase by 101% for state schools and by 70% for non-state schools. For students, this will mean opportunity to get the best results from school. For parents, it will mean the choice remains affordable. For teachers, it will mean certainty of funding so that they can get on with the job. And what has the independent school sector said today? Our package has its full support. And what has the National Catholic Education Commission said today? The NCEC fully supports the package of measures unveiled today. On this side of the House, we all believe in the ability for kids to have the best education they can and to make sure that that is affordable choice. But sadly, we do know that that affordable choice isn't always bipartisan in this place, and we want to make sure
Members
in our
on my
heart
left.
of hearts that in your heart of hearts you agree to this package.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. Since 2013, the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government has denied that it's cutting school funding. Today, the Prime Minister stood up and admitted cutting funding to Catholic and independent schools and pledged to restore part of that funding. Will the Prime Minister and the Education Minister also restore the $14 billion that's been cut from public schools over the next decade?
Treasurer will cease interjecting. The Minister for Education has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Minister for her question. And it gives me the chance to inform the House that when it comes to government schools, they're getting record funding levels. When it comes to Catholic schools, they're getting record funding levels. When it comes to independent schools, they're getting record funding levels. And it also gives me the chance just to mention to the House what that funding looks like. Commonwealth funding for state schools was $6.8 billion last year. $6.8 billion last year. It will be $7.3 billion this year. It will be $7.9 billion next year, and $8.6 billion the year after that. I think that is going up. As a matter of fact, it's quite interesting. From 2017 to 2027, Commonwealth funding to state schools will grow by 86%. According to the Productivity Commission, since 2006, on a per-student basis, Commonwealth funding to state schools has increased by 78.5%. But this is an incredibly important point. This is compared to 7.7% increase in the contribution from the state and territory governments. So if we need to be encouraging anyone to increase their funding for state schools, it's state and territory governments.
The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how our government's strong economic plan is standing by Australian families and homeowners to get a strong start and have a go, including in my electorate of Ford? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ford for his question. And he knows that the Liberal and National parties are committed to helping Australian families, Mr Speaker, and that those opposite will only give Australian families more debt, more deficit, higher taxes, Mr Speaker, and less jobs for Australian families. Now, that's why in this year's budget we introduced a number of measures to help Australian families. Our personal income tax plan will leave more money in the pocket of Australian families. Our support for PBS will help them lower the price of drugs. Our support for childcare and new initiatives there will ease the cost of living. But we're also working hard to support families when it comes to housing affordability, Mr Speaker. Now, with our first homeowner super saver scheme, this will allow first homeowners to more quickly save for a deposit, Mr Speaker. Investments in affordable housing on the supply side, Mr Speaker, are helping to get more construction in the sector with our tax incentives, Mr Speaker, and we're making it more attractive for older Australians to downsize and to put some of the proceeds from the sale of those properties into their super, Mr Speaker. Now, these initiatives are working. These initiatives are working because in 2017-2018, 115,000 first home owners got a loan, Mr Speaker. Now, that was the biggest number since 2009-10, Mr Speaker, since 2009-10. And we've heard from the Reserve Bank of Australia talk about the positive developments when it comes to credit in the housing market, Mr Speaker. Now, we know what is being offered by those opposite. A big new tax on housing, Mr Speaker. A big new tax on housing. A tax which will affect 100,000 teachers, nurses and military personnel, Mr Speaker, and a big tax that affects 2/3 of people who have a taxable income under $80,000, Mr Speaker. Now, this is what one analyst said of Labor's big new housing tax. It would have a negative impact on buyer confidence, Mr Speaker. So we know when it comes to supporting Australian families, we'll put more money in their pockets on the Liberal and National Party. We'll ease their cost of living with new initiatives around childcare and health, and we'll also ensure more affordable housing, particularly for first home-owned buyers.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. 2 out of every 3 children, about 2.5 million kids, go to a public school. Why is the government continuing to cut $14 billion out of public schools over the next decade? And do you guarantee that agreements with states and territories for public school funding will be signed in the next 14 days, as the Prime Minister promised yesterday?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Shadow Minister for her question. And can I just reiterate again, and this comes from someone who attended a public school for part of their public schooling, a state school. So this is something which I take incredibly seriously. Commonwealth funding for state schools was $6.8 billion last year.
Member for Bendigo.
It will be $7.3 billion this year. It will be $7.9 billion next year and $8.6 billion the year after that. Now, when it comes to the bilateral negotiations with state and territory governments, as I said last Friday at the Education Council meeting, I look forward to beginning those negotiations as of now, and I look forward to concluding them as soon as I possibly can. And I've already had very good discussions with New South Wales, very good discussions with the Northern Territory, and I made an offer to the Queensland State Minister, Grace, who I'm sure the Shadow Minister would know, that I'm happy to fly to Brisbane and begin negotiating with her at any time that she would like as well.
Very good, Minister.
The member for Sydney.
I seek leave to table a document, Mr Speaker. It's the document that shows the $22 billion cut over the decade by the Turnbull government from schools.
Leave's not granted.
It's your document.
The member for Sydney will resume her seat. The member for Murray.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how our government is standing by Australian families, cutting red tape and letting common sense drive support for rural and regional Australians during this drought? And might different ideas stifle small business growth in rural and regional Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Murray for his question. Tough times need common sense, and that's precisely what's happening. That's what this government is delivering. We came to government with a promise to cut red tape and make it simpler for small businesses to do what they do, and that's they do it best. They do it best of all the businesses, small and family, medium enterprises. They do it best. That's why from midnight tonight, truckies will no longer have the red tape burden in getting practical support to drought-affected communities. Larger loads of hay and fodder will be allowed to travel on state and national control roads. And I've just received this hot off the press. The Victorian farmers welcome hay trucking relief, the media release, and their president, VFF Grain's President Ross John, said, "We hope this is the first step towards a harmonised national hay carting notice." And it is. It's harmonised. It's going to go right across state and national roads. Heavy vehicles up to a maximum height of 4.6 metres and 2.83 metres wide will no longer require a permit to access the existing state-controlled road networks. Now, previously, access was limited for Class 3 vehicles up to 2.6 metres wide and 4.3 metres wide. You might need to listen to this, Labor leader. You are a bit of a straw man. You are a bit of a straw man, but you might need to listen to this. We're harmonising those laws across the states and eliminating permits. Now, the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator Notice will remove the need for up to 6,000 consents a year. This is important for our drought communities. This is important for those farmers who need the hay, who need the fodder to feed their animals. This will benefit small family businesses such as Peacock's Transport in Rochester, run by Alex Peacock and his daughter Beth. Now, they cut hay into the drought-affected communities interstate. They're good people. Like so many, they've opened their hearts, they've opened their wallets. That's true country spirit. They want to get on with the job of helping those drought-stricken communities, and they see the changes as being very positive. These changes increase their capacity to deliver fodder into drought-affected areas interstate. Now, it's estimated that farming operators will save the equivalent of up to 54,000 days per year applying for and waiting for permits. So that's across the board, 54,000 days. It's equivalent to 148 years of bureaucracy. Gone like that. Gone like that. That's what it's doing. It follows investment in programs such as Roads to Recovery, the Drought Communities program, which put power into the hands of locals to make local decisions. But what will those opposite do? Well, they'll put a wrecking ball through all of those rural communities, and I tell you what they'll do. They will reinstate the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal, and that will force that will force family-owned trucking companies off the road. It will unionise the trucking sector.
Members on my
now,
left,
I
the
know
member
that's
for
what you
Shortland.
want. I know that's what you want, but why force those hard-working, family-owned trucking companies off the road?
The
Why put
Deputy
them out
Prime
of
Minister's
business?
time has
Just not
concluded.
right.
I call the member for Franklin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Senior Australians and Aged Care. Yesterday in question time, the Minister said the funding for ACFI expenditure has continued to increase against claims across all three domains. Can the Minister confirm there was actually an average per-resident funding cut of $6,655 per year from 2017 due to his government's cuts, according to a report commissioned by Uniting Care?
The Minister for Senior Australians and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the Shadow Minister and the member for Franklin for her question. Record funding of $19.8 billion this year, $6.5 billion more than Labor provided in its last full financial year. The funding for ACFI expenditure has continued to increase against claims across all three domains. Average funding of subsidies and supplements per person per year in residential aged care is $66,000 in 2017-18 compared to $53,000 in 2012 and 13, with payments increasing every year under this government. Complex healthcare payments per person per year are up from 2015-16 before MyEFO and the budget of the 2016 changes. On average, $19,100 paid per person per year in 2017 and 18 compared to $18,900 in 2015-16. In 2015-16, the figure was $18,900. In 2016-17, it went to $19,500, and at the moment, this is per person. Yes, of course it is. And 2017-18 is $19,100. But let me quote from a joint press conference between Prime Minister Gillard
Members on both
and
sides.
Minister Butler to announce Living Longer, Living Better legislation on the 20th of April 2012. Look, there are some providers who've been unusually claiming levels of money that we don't think they're entitled to, and they may be unhappy that the jig is up.
Resume his seat for a second. If the minister can just take a seat. The member for Franklin on a point of order.
Directly relevant, he must talk about the per-resident funding for ACFI post your budget cuts. You have not answered the question at all.
Member for Franklin will resume his seat. The minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I've finished.
The member for Franklin, member for Grainlow. You haven't got the call yet. You're being denied the call by the member for Grainlow. Do you want to negotiate with him, Leader of the House? The member for Franklin seeking to table a document.
Yes, Speaker, I'm seeking to table a document that shows the per-resident funding cut from ACFI due to their budget cuts.
Leave granted.
Of course
Leave is not granted. The member for Ryan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women. Will the Minister please update the House on how our government's stewardship of the economy is helping to support the financial security of Australian women and is standing by Australian families? And is the Minister aware of any threats posed by alternative approaches?
The Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women.
I thank the member for Ryan for her question and for her hard work on behalf of all of her constituents. She knows how important it is that as a government we need to be focused on the economic security of women, and we are. I reminded the House only yesterday about the great strides that we are making for women's retirement income with the flexibility changes that we have brought into the system for working women, something that those opposite would like to abolish if given a chance. We have provided more support for families, particularly for low and middle income earners particularly, through our childcare package that commenced operation from the 1st of July this year. And this year's budget included more initiatives for women's economic capability and leadership, with funding for packages like Women in STEM to increase female participation in maths, sciences and engineering. And it's also very clear that the government's economic plan is working. We have created more than 1.1 million jobs since coming to government. The majority of those jobs have been taken up by women. There are more women in work than ever before, and more women in full-time work than ever before. But of course, we won't stop there. This year, I will deliver the first ever Women's Economic Security Statement, which will provide practical supports to provide more opportunities for increasing women's economic security. Now, those opposite like to talk a really big game when it comes to economic security of women, but let's actually have a look at their record. When they left office, women's full-time employment was actually going backwards. And, Mr Speaker, they don't just like to hike up taxes. Those opposite, when you look at their record, hiked up the gender pay gap to 17.2% on their watch. Now, they hate hearing it, but it is true. Under our government, it has been reduced to 14.5%. It is still high, but it is trending in the right direction, and we are very focused on making it go down even further. Now, they like to pretend that they care about women's retirement balances, but the Leader of the Opposition faces a test. He faces a test because we have a package in the Senate right now that would end the rorts and the rip-offs. He has a test because he could support that package. He could apologise for the fact that when he was the minister, he was the one that scrapped the fee protections for people with low balance accounts. He could make it right by supporting the government's package and increasing the retirement income for millions of Australian women to the tune of billions of dollars. But if he won't, he stands condemned by his record.
The minister's time has expired. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has ridiculed Australians who want to know why Malcolm Turnbull is not the Prime Minister, telling them to just get over it. How can he expect Australians to get over something that has never been explained to them? Why can't the Prime Minister answer this simple question? Why isn't Malcolm Turnbull the Prime Minister of Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I further member with the earlier answers. What the Australian people know is that our government is taking action on the things that matter to them, whether it's a Royal Commission into residential aged care, which has been our focus this week, whether it's taking action on the drought, which has been our focus this week, Mr Speaker, whether it's resolving the issues in ensuring choice for parents in non-state schools. That's been our focus this week. What the Leader of the Opposition has been doing today and all week has just been focusing on the Canberra bubble. He's been sitting over there during question time, sledging away, carrying on like the usual Canberra politician that Australians are sick of.
The member for Isaacs will leave under 94A. The member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister update the House on how our government is standing by Australian families to grow small and family businesses, creating more jobs for Australians? Is the Minister aware of any threats to the livelihoods of family businesses?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Moore for his question. I have visited his electorate previously, and I know that the member for Moore is absolutely 100% committed to backing small and family businesses in his electorate, as is every member on this side of the House, because we understand how important small and family businesses are to our economy. Now, I do thank the member for his question. I'd like to tell the House about the great support that the coalition government has provided to support the businesses in his electorate. So, under the coalition government, my department alone has provided over $727,000 to support businesses in the electorate of Moore. This is over a wide range of services. It includes business advisory services, it's to work with researchers, and importantly, it's to assist with the commercialisation of research. Now, this week I launched the Coalition Government's Small and Medium Enterprise Export Hub program. This is specifically designed to help businesses in sectors including manufacturing and food to begin to export for the very first time. This $20 million program, which is part of the Taking Local Businesses Global Initiative that we announced in the 2017-18 budget, complements our Industry Growth Centre initiative. Now, that means that we have growth centres in place in 6 key industries that are working to make sure that Australian businesses get support. So, businesses that are, for example, including our food producers and more broadly in manufacturing, we are working as a coalition government to make sure that we are providing support to them. And I would like to acknowledge the great work that our industry growth centres have actually done.
Member for Hunter.
So over 15,000 stakeholders have engaged with the food and agribusiness growth centre programs, and our centre has funded a number of projects through partnering with industry totalling nearly $19 million. That's to help generate new products with potential sales of over $50 million. That growth centre alone has been supporting over 450 small and family businesses, companies that are working at international trade shows, trying to boost their exposure and help them to create more sales and revenue. Mr Speaker, the coalition government is absolutely committed to supporting small and family businesses. We're backing them to have a go, and we know that when they have a go, it's a win-win situation for Australia. It's good for the firm, it's good for their local region, and it's good for Australia.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware of a report about the no-confidence motion in the Minister for Home Affairs, which says 9 News has confirmed the member for Banks was overheard telling colleagues, and I quote, "Supporting that man is not what I want to be doing." How can the Prime Minister continue to protect the minister when even his own colleagues have lost confidence in him? Is this why the Prime Minister describes his own government as a Muppet show?
The Leader of the House, on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, we have quite a large licence in this place in question time, but asking the Prime Minister about rumours...
The Leader of the House can resume his seat. The question is clearly out of order. Clearly out of order. I'll move to the next question. The member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister update the House on how our government is standing by Australian families by delivering simpler and more affordable private health insurance for the more than 13 million Australians who rely on it? Minister, are you aware of any ideas that would undermine the viability of Australia's private health insurance system?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Barker, who believes deeply in the opportunity for families to have lower cost and more choice and peace of mind from private health insurance, as does everybody on this side. It's something we believe in. On the other side, Labor hates private health insurance. They took an axe to it last time they were in government, and they'll take an axe to it if they ever get onto this side of the Treasury benches again. And how do we know? Because we just heard from the member for Sydney. And what did the member for Sydney say about private health insurance in commenting on her time as Health Minister? She said, and I quote, "Every promise I made, I paid for." How did I pay for it? I paid for it by targeting private health insurance. Targeting private health insurance. That's what they think of choice. That's what they think of peace of mind. And how did they do this? They ripped away the rebate when they were in government. And who was it who suffered? Pensioners, low-income earners, families. They were the ones that paid, with record hikes in private health insurance under their watch. They didn't care and they couldn't manage, and the Australian public paid for their incompetence. By contrast, what have we done? We have just passed legislation through both houses of parliament that will deliver lower pressures on private health insurance and simpler and more understandable and more effective approaches to private health insurance. What does it include? It includes better access to mental health care for people in private health insurance with no waiting time for upgrades, better access for rural and remote and regional patients, and in addition to that it includes discounts of up to 10% for young people under the age of 30. But more than that, because of the $1 billion of cost we were able to take out of it through the agreement with the device makers, we were able to deliver the lowest change in premium in 17 years, lower than every year under Labor, lower than every year under Labor. But all of this is significant, and we think we'll do better again this year. But what Labor is proposing now for the future isn't a 10%, isn't an 11% or a 12 or a 13 or a 14 or even a 15% price hike. It's a 16% price hike in private health insurance premiums. And why is that? Because in the fine print of everything they're proposing is the proposal to rip away the rebate for lower cost policies. And if you rip away the rebate, that will have a massive impact on the lower cost premiums, which will affect those who are on lower incomes. So under Labor, pensioners and families will pay more for private health insurance.
The member for Rankin has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister describe his own government as the Muppet Show?
Prime Minister has the call. Members on my right.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question, and I thank him for
Prime
his
Minister will
interest.
resume his seat. Prime Minister will resume his seat. The members for Solomon and Oxley will leave the chamber under 94A. And the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for his question. The events of about 4 or 5 weeks ago, I think, disappointed Australians greatly in the way that things were conducted in this place. I'm honest enough to admit that and tell the Australian people straight about it. And I did tell the Australian people straight about that. But I tell you what's happened since then. Our party is coming back quickly together. We're getting back on the front foot. And I hear the jeers and I hear the sneers of the members opposite. But I can tell you, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition isn't as looking as certain he was 2 weeks ago before we came back to this House, Mr Speaker. He's been sitting there in question time today. He's been sitting there in question time today.
Members on
with
both
his
sides.
cheeky little sneers, and they're doing their little stunts, Mr Speaker. I can tell you they're looking under a bit more pressure than they did 2 weeks ago, Mr Speaker. And you know why? Because our government's getting on with it and they know it, Mr Speaker. They know our government is taking decisions that matter to the Australian people. They know that we're focused on the things that concern Australians,
Prime Minister,
like dealing with food tampering, Mr Speaker.
members on my left will cease interrupting question time. I'll have no hesitation in dealing with them. Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, they know we're focused 100% on them, that we're looking through the dust of all the dust that those opposite want to kick up as they come into this place. You know how many questions they've asked me about drought this week? After more than 50 questions to me this week? One. Just one question on drought, Mr Speaker. They've been more interested in the politics of Canberra than the principles and the beliefs and the values and the issues the Australian people are interested in. That's why this Leader of the Opposition has not been able to convince the Australian people over 5 years that he's not up to the job, Mr Speaker. They know he's a phony. They know he's not up to it, Mr Speaker, and this has been demonstrated by him every day in the job. Our government over 5 years has been delivering for Australians with a stronger economy, guaranteeing the essential services that Australians rely on, keeping Australians safe and keeping Australians together. Now, I hear the Leader of the Opposition interjecting, and I know that the Leader of the Opposition, after there was our last change of the leadership, he said he's been responsible for dispatching 4 leaders, Mr Speaker. 2 of them were his own, Mr Speaker. He said to a colleague on this side of the House after it happened, that makes 4. That's how this Leader of the Opposition sees this place. He sees it as a game. He sees it as a political game where he gets together with his union thug mates and gets around and tries to dispense his power
Members
and
for
influence.
Kingston and Rankin.
Well, the Australian people see right through this bloke, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister's
they
time
can see
has
right
concluded.
into it.
The member for Mackellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Family and Social Services. Can the Minister outline for the House how this government is standing by Australian families through affordable housing targeted at vulnerable Australians? Is he aware of alternative approaches?
The Minister for Family and Social Services.
Well, I do thank the member for Mackellar for his question. He is a very strong advocate for measures designed to assist Australians, including vulnerable Australians, to access the housing that they need, and he's got a long-standing interest in serious and important matters of concern to the Australian people, unlike the trivial and silly stuff that we so often see from the other side. Now, Mr Speaker, one of the key elements of our policies, of our Liberal National Government policies to support Australians in the provision of housing is, of course, Commonwealth rent assistance, $4.5 billion a year to more than 1.3 million individuals and families, supporting people in the private rental market. And of course, Mr Speaker, if we are to be able to deliver this kind of support for people who need it, it is so important that we have a sustainable social welfare system. If people who are eligible for Commonwealth rental assistance come to the Commonwealth and seek it, they need to know that the Commonwealth has the capacity to pay. And that is why it is so important to have a sustainable welfare system, to have a strong economy so that we can fund the services that Australians rely upon. Now, Mr Speaker, when Labor was in government, tax revenue was growing at 3.3% a year, but spending on social security and welfare was growing at nearly twice that, and that is unsustainable. Under this government, Mr Speaker, we're in a position where tax revenue is growing at 5.2%, social security and welfare spending growing at 3.7%. That is sustainable, a sustainable social welfare system. And of course we are backing and supporting Australians in obtaining housing through a whole package of measures, including $1.5 billion for the new National Housing and Homelessness Agreement between the Commonwealth and states and territories. That is funding to state and territory governments which is linked to outcomes in priority areas, such as aggregate supply targets, including targets for social and affordable housing, the renewal of public housing stock and homelessness services, and of course we're maintaining annual homelessness funding over 3 years. And what did the CEO of Homes for Homes say? He said the government's investment in Homes for Homes
demonstrates they are serious about supporting innovative new ways to tackle Australia's housing crisis. Mr Speaker, it is so important we have a sustainable social welfare system, that we have a strong budget and a strong economy so that we can support Australians in need. That is what our Liberal national government has consistently been delivering.
The member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that in the last month the government deposed the democratically elected Prime Minister for a new Prime Minister no one voted for? Nationals MPs have been in open revolt against the Deputy Prime Minister because of his failure to deliver an agriculture visa, and women in the government are quitting in disgust or being forced out. Why should Australians pay the price for a government which the Prime Minister himself has described as the Muppet Show?
The Prime Minister has the floor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I wonder if the member—
Prime Minister.
I wonder if the member can explain why this week he hasn't asked me one question about the drought, Mr Speaker.
The member for Hunter will resume his seat.
The
member for Hunter will resume his seat. The Prime Minister is 11 seconds into his answer. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker. Once again, when Labor lie about things, Mr Speaker, we don't have to believe them, we don't have to accept those lies. The Australian people don't accept those lies. What we are doing, Mr Speaker, when it comes to agriculture and in particular the drought, is being 100% focused on the needs of those families and on those towns. On the 26th of October there will be a summit on drought here in Canberra, bringing together state and territories, bringing together representatives from across the agricultural sector. Major General Stephen Day will be here reporting on the actions that are being taken in coordination by the government to ensure that we can deliver not just the relief, not just the recovery, but the resilience that is needed into the decades to come. And just today, one of the actions that we took, and I want to particularly commend the member for Wright for his role as the Assistant Minister here, we made sure that we got rid of a regulation that was going to stop feed getting to where the farmers need it. Now, this was a very practical thing that we've done. This government is about doing practical things, whether it's supporting our strawberry farmers to ensure that the tampering that took place can get that industry and get those farmers back on their feet, encouraging Australians to get behind them, and I appreciate the support of both sides and all parties in the House to ensure the smooth passage of that legislation. Our government's getting on with it, Mr Speaker. The opposition might not be able to move on. They might be stuck in reverse, Mr Speaker, but we're in drive.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Seniors and Aged Care. Will the minister update the House on how our government is standing by Australian families to support and protect older Australians?
The Minister for Seniors and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the member for Grey for his continued and ongoing interest in looking after senior Australians. This government, or our government, has a $5 billion record funding level over the next 5 years, over the forward estimate of 4 years, to support senior Australians. It is based around better access to care, better quality of care and better ageing. And aged care funding in 2017-18 will increase from $18.6 billion and will grow to $23.6 billion in 21-22. Since our government was elected, aged care funding has increased by an average of 6.1%. Since the last budget, we are delivering 20,000 new high-level home care packages, and that will continue to grow from 87,000 through to 151,000, ensuring that senior Australians have access to home care packages that enables them to live within their communities. We're adding an additional 13,500 residential aged care places and 750 short-term restorative care places. By 2021-22, there will be an overall 74,000 high-level care packages for those who will have those needs because of the complex health conditions that they have. They are continuing to be supported through packages that range from level 1 through to 2 and have support through the Commonwealth Home Support Program. It is about looking after. And in addition to that, we have created the new Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, which is going to fulfil the function of bringing all those elements together. Now, let me tell you that our government is doing further to support senior Australians. The Royal Commission is one of them, because what we want to do is to look at those things that the Quality Agency has also identified as being important areas. And whilst members interject, what we need to think about is that the bottom line is about senior Australians in residential aged care and in home care, and that's why we've provided $50 million to support aged care providers to implement the new quality standards that are absolutely critical to ensuring that the quality of homes and people in home and in residential care is considered and looked after very carefully. It is not about neglecting. It is about considering their needs in a way that is absolutely important, and the Royal Commission will help to identify those areas that are in the shades of grey that we need to seriously consider. And that's not a problem, Leader of the Opposition. It is important that both sides of this chamber make sure that those who built this nation are looked after, cared for and given every consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Concluded. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.